Look all around the world today, and you will find the lessons and the warnings and the stark reminders of the incredibly high, historic stakes of November's presidential election here and in the fight for democracy against autocracy all over the world. In France, voters came out in force for parties on the left and the center to deny that country's far right a chance at running the government for the first time since World War II. It was a stunning upset made possible by an extraordinary effort by parties and voters from across that center to center left ideological spectrum to put aside differences and unite when faced with an authoritarian threat. Hundreds of miles away, the deadliest and most devastating war in Europe since the Second World War grinds on and has taken a grisly turn this weekend. Russia struck Ukraine's largest children's hospital on Monday as part of a barrage of strikes all across that country. Vladimir Putin shows no sign of drawing back his ambition of recreating Soviet-era power, believing he can and will outlast the West's attention span and resolve in its support for Ukraine. It's a notion seemingly confirmed by ex-President Donald Trump's own former national security advisor, who says this, quote, Putin is waiting for Trump. Even further afield, Hungarian leader Viktor Orban, another favorite of Donald Trump's, has been repeatedly praised and was recently met with Donald Trump. Met with another of the ex-president's favorite autocrats, Xi Jinping. All of this is the context for the mother of all battles, the preservation of democracy that's taking place right here in our country, in these United States. An election, our next guest bottom lines for us by arguing, essentially, if Trump wins, America ends. Let that sink in. With the very successful incumbent president, President Joe Biden, facing some pretty strong political headwinds 120 days ahead of the November election, with voters currently telling pollsters they prefer President Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, in every major poll that we have seen, Democrats are right now grappling with the question of who is the best person to prosecute the case against Donald Trump and his clearly, flagrantly authoritarian agenda. President Joe Biden today, in an interview with the host of Morning Joe, answering that question, saying, I am, and warning that no one should ever count him out. Listen.
You may remember, I was one of the few people out there publicly saying before the 2022 election, there will be no red wave. There will be no red wave. Because I've been all over the country. I didn't believe it at all. And then in 2023, the key elections, I went into those races. Not every one of them, but a lot of them. And I said we were going to win. Look, we won those. So, Joe, it wasn't just that it didn't happen. I was predicting beforehand it would not happen. Because I've got a pretty good political instinct and eye. And here's the deal. It's not going to happen here this time around. The American public is not going to move away from me as an average voter. He called the Americans in the cemeteries from World War I suckers and losers. And so this guy's going to have to start to answer for what he did. I'm not letting up, Joe. I am not letting up a little bit. And by the way, France registered, look, you talk about Europe. France rejected extremism. Democrats will reject it here as well. Trump, and this is a guy who is an extreme candidate. I can't think of a candidate in my lifetime that's been more extreme. He makes George Wallace look like a patriot.
It's where we start today with Yale University history professor and author of the best-selling book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Tim Snyder's back with us. It struck me when you said yes to being here that this is the second time in an hour of real crisis we have turned to you. The last time we had the privilege of speaking with you, it was on the day that our company had brought on Ronna McDaniel, and we really turned to you to understand the moment and understand why it was so difficult. And obviously she's no longer with the company, but so much of what you help people understand is that authoritarianism isn't just what the authoritarian takes, which is a lot of what Trump seems to perceive it is, but a lot of what is given freely. And I wonder if you can help us understand this moment in that context.
Well, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, the first lesson of On Tyranny, which you're kind enough to mention, is don't obey in advance. And I think for all of us, and perhaps especially for the media, it's very important not to assume that the right has to win. It's very important not to make adjustments for how we would behave should Trump win before he does win. And because most Americans may not have experience with these kinds of authoritarian transitions, the part of our mind which automatically adjusts and tries to minimize risks is going to make those adjustments. And I'm afraid there is a fair amount of that already going on in the media. Right now, we are in general much softer on Trump. And I think one of the reasons for that is that people aren't confronting perhaps their own fears or their own anticipation about what might happen to them or their colleagues, their institutions, should Trump actually come to power. There's an ironic way in which the thing that one really has to report, which is what would an American regime change towards fascism look like? That very thing can also deter you from doing it because it's hard to confront, or you're worried that you're going to be the one to say the thing which is going too far.
I need you to say more, and I think that what you're putting your finger on is this. It is true that every journalist is at risk professionally, their physical safety, their ability to do the jobs that sent them to journalism school or whatever it is that got them into the role of a working press. It is all on the line in the election. So journalists, not a single one of them is an objective, detached actor in this election. But what you're describing feels like an inability for the mind to adapt to that because you're also trained in objectivity. Just talk a little bit more about how that balance can be struck.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And it's one that reporters in war zones and in authoritarian regimes have had to confront since there's ever been reporting. A lot of my friends, not just inside but outside the United States, are reporting in situations where they are in some sense or another at risk. And I think you're right. You can't in that situation just treat yourself as a neutral observer. I think everyone, we're all human. Everyone has to confront the fear. Because the problem is if you don't acknowledge and confront the fear, you'll drift towards the things that are easier to say. So, for example, I think the debate around, who the Democratic candidate can be is perfectly reasonable to have. But when everyone piles on and when everyone says the same thing about Mr. Biden, then one begins to think, okay, perhaps we're saying this because it's the easiest thing to say. Perhaps we're going to feel courageous doing the thing which is in fact safe. And perhaps, the deep down, it's the fear of what will happen to us if Trump wins, which is pushing us all in this same direction. And that would be normal. That would be human. That would be historically what happens. But it's a level, I think, of self-awareness that all of us who write, including journalists, have to develop in this particular time. Because the irony is, if you don't confront your own fear, then your fears actually become reality. If you don't confront your fear, if you make it easier for this candidate, you're actually putting yourself in danger. You're actually generating the very danger that you're afraid of because you're making it easier for that person to come to power.
I mean, it's also sort of an abuse and trauma paradigm, right? With the dictator or the autocrat or the tyrant as the abuser, and you sort of adapt if you think you're going to have to live under the abuser's rule or power. Can we sort of go through, because you mentioned the debate, and I want to read from your Substack yesterday. Let me do that first, because I want to ask you to be prescriptive for us. I think we're all looking for guiding lights, and I think you already know you're one of mine. You write this about fascism and fear. When media folks describe discussions among Democrats as chaos and disarray, they are implicitly suggesting that it is better for a leader of a party to never be questioned. An obvious point goes missed. Democrats can say what they want because none of them is afraid, and that's good. Governor Maura Healey can express her dissent, and Joe Biden can express his frustration with her, but no one is worried about her physical safety. Trump, by contrast, controls his party through stochastic terror threats issued through social media that his cult followers can be expected to realize. Republicans leave politics because they fear for themselves and their families. Those who remain all obey in advance. That is new, and it should not become normal, and it should not spread any further. But it becomes normal when we treat discussions and not coercion as abnormal. This is what has so, I don't know the right word, but traumatized or upset our viewers. They think there's some disloyalty to the good guy in covering the debate. But I hear you making a distinction between the debate happened and it was covered that day, but the frenzy is what becomes asymmetric. Is that right?
Yeah, this is tricky. I mean, I have maybe a slightly different view about what the debate means. I mean, for somebody who wants American democracy to continue, my view is the debate actually, I mean, honestly, I see it in kind of positive terms. I see it as an opportunity for there to be a discussion at whatever level that discussion needs to be had. The president obviously he's the presumptive nominee. He has the delegates. It's entirely up to him. He's had an incredible first term. But I think it makes sense for there to be a discussion. If we don't think there should be a discussion, then suddenly we are a little bit acting like, well, there's a cult of personality around the president, or it's all us versus them. And anybody who says that there should be a discussion, they're somehow part of a plot, or they're actually on the other side, or whatever it might be. But it makes it harder, and that's why I wrote the piece you mentioned. It makes it harder to have that discussion, which takes a little bit of courage, after all, if the press is piling on the president. Because then you really do feel like, well, maybe I'm being a little disloyal, or I'm just part of the pile on, because other people are afraid. It makes it harder for you to do the right thing. And I think that's the way this discussion has been warped right now. I mean, I think a lot of good people who have something to think about are having a harder time doing it because they perceive, well, look, everybody else is afraid. Everybody else is piling on. Everybody else is doing this easy thing. So I have to be in a defensive crouch. I have to protect my guy. So I think there's a way in which people's overall fear of Trump and of the regime change shapes discussions which might not even seem to be directly about that thing. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the discussions.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.